What's up, guys? My name is Fari, and I help info-led businesses scale effectively through their backend infrastructure. And in today's video, we're going to be going through why communication architecture matters, how I believe that this is one of the most crucial things that ultimately powers how info-led businesses ultimately scale, and also one of the things that is less spoken about. And this is simply because most businesses don't have a communication problem, they have a communication architecture problem. And what this basically means is that they've never designed the pathways that their information is supposed to travel through. And business, when we ask it from a first principles approach, we then understand that business is a flow of energy between decision points. And when energy gets stuck, execution slows down. And where energy flows freely, the company is then able to move 10x faster. But this basically means that if the founder is acting as the three parts, which is basically the router, the filter, and the bottleneck as well, the entire business slows down to the speed of whoever is the most disorganized person within the chain. And how do you combat this? By understanding what the truth actually is within this, and that is a company isn't limited necessarily by talent, it's limited by decision latency. How long it takes for information to get from point A to point B without distortion. And this distortion ultimately is the determining factor of how fast things actually gets done and how communication also flows as well. But that also means that if your communication systems are sloppy, your execution will equally be as sloppy. And that ultimately governs how you're able to then allow information to flow across the different stakeholders, from your founder to your closers to your setters as well. And by starting where the information flows and not where the tasks necessarily start, we can then understand that most founders built the project first and then pray that communication sorts itself out, which it rarely ever does. And that's why before we even start executing on anything, we need to make sure that we're designing these mechanisms, of which are who owns which decisions, what are the decisions that need to be owned by this specific individual, and what inputs each owner needs to have as well. What are the inputs that each of the owners need to have within this specific project, such so that information flows freely. And understanding that what the exact triggers for handoffs are, understanding that each and every single handoff that we have within the specific information flow ultimately has a specific trigger. Once that trigger gets activated, we can then transition into a handoff. And understanding what done means at every single stage. And don't get me wrong, countless of times I've hit this stage where the definition of done ultimately gets more complex as the more things get added into the system. And the key determining factor of understanding how information ultimately flows is making sure that we clearly define in writing what done actively means at every single stage, and how ultimately the feedback loops close as a result of that. And if you don't design for this upfront, you end up with invisible bottlenecks, duplicated work, and also the I thought you meant moments that ultimately tax your entire business. And we ultimately know that those I thought you meant moments ultimately lead to context being lost and also time being drained from the activities that ultimately bring in revenue for your specific business. Because understanding that great businesses aren't fast because they're talented, they're fast because their information pathways are ultimately engineered in a manner that allows them to have this free flow of information, and there's no bottlenecks in terms of communication flow because everyone is simply on the same page on what needs to get done and when it needs to get done. But that ultimately means that we need to make sure that we define who decides what, or chaos ultimately steps in. And one of the big misconceptions, or one of the big myths, is that shared accountability is the moat. And this ultimately means that you are sharing responsibility with someone else, as opposed to taking full ownership and being a team player and understanding that each and every single person has their role that they need to play within the team. This isn't necessarily about blaming, it's human nature, because when no one is fully responsible, everyone defaults to inaction. And you don't fix human nature, you ultimately engineer around it. You can never truly fix what human nature ultimately ultimately does, but you can ultimately engineer mechanisms that act around it, and also making sure that you have these specific roles that decisions need to ultimately feed off of, and ensuring that every single decision needs to have a direct responsible person, someone that is directly responsible for the specific thing that needs to get done. Clear reviewers, basically people that are coming in reviewing what needs to get done, how the project is ultimately progressing, and also informed observers, basically people that are on the sidelines per se, that are ultimately informed on what the specific aspects are, and also making sure that they're observing is progress actively getting done, and also ensuring that a clear pathway to escalation is also in hand, such so that if there is a problem, that communication ultimately plays a factor in this, because there's a clear mechanism of escalation that ultimately plays into this, and also a decision timeout, basically understanding that each and every single decision needs to have a timeout, otherwise it would be carried over to tomorrow. And if we don't have a timeout for when a decision ultimately needs to get made, we ultimately increase that decision latency. We need to make sure that each and every single decision that we're doing and getting done needs to get completed in XYZ time and not carried over till the next day. But understanding that all of this ultimately means that you're turning your business from a social hierarchy into a mechanism where people stop guessing and projects stop stalling, and this is because execution becomes deterministic and not emotional, because your inputs ultimately directly correlate to the outputs that you're ultimately getting, and you're not just feeding off of emotional responses. But through this, you ultimately need to understand that we need to make sure that we are engineering handoffs such as a critical infrastructure. And I cannot hammer this enough of understanding that there's so much time that gets lost in messy handoffs than anywhere else. If you're not engineering clean handoffs so that everyone is on page of what needs to get done in terms of the context packet, you're ultimately losing and bleeding a lot of time. And what ultimately carries over in this specific context packet, it's ultimately three things. It's the goal, constraints, and acceptance criteria. The goals are what are the specific goals that we need to hit at the specific stage, and the constraints then become, hey, what are the key bottlenecks that ultimately can stop us from getting this done in XYZ manner. And then also having an acceptance criteria, we need to make sure that if we don't have this packet, no work ultimately gets done. And this ultimately eliminates half of the chaos in any single business, simply because you have the context packet and you understand what are the three mechanisms that need to be governed within this context packet, such so that you ultimately moving things forward at each and every single stage. But that ultimately results in us understanding that we need to make sure that we're building a single source of truth, and understanding that if your information lives in Slack, WhatsApp, Notion, or someone else's head, then the business is operating in 5 different versions of reality and not one singular version of reality that everything ultimately feeds off of. And this source needs to ultimately have 4 things, which are the specs. What are the specific specs that we need to have at this specific stage? The decisions, what are the decisions that we ultimately need to make, and how those ultimately push the project forward, or what it is that we're doing forward, and the tasks at hand, what do we ultimately need to do that ultimately push what it is that we're doing forward, and as well as the KPIs, which are your metrics. So this can be XYZ revenue, or we need to hit XYZ show up rate, or whatever the case may be, such so that we have all these versions of reality feeding into one specific source of truth that ultimately governs how the business ultimately functions. Because if you have 5 different versions of reality, it's super easy for context to get lost within the process, and ultimately streamlining this and creating leverage through this, because all of these ultimately center around creating leverage, and one clear packet multiplies the output of every person downstream, and this is how you kill information decay and ensure everyone executes inside the same world of reality and and what is actively true, because you have so many different people that you need to interact with. And how are you going to interact with them if you have 5 different versions of reality? They're not communicating or aren't necessarily feeding off from each other. So basically creating leverage, and Hormozi and Naval Ravikant speak a lot about this, of how can you basically use these different tools and these different realms in order to create leverage for your specific business. And all of this acts such so that we understand that technology is mainly built to route information, not necessarily to replace thinking. And this means that your technology or your tech stack should ultimately amplify clarity and not hide dysfunction, because dysfunction ultimately scales when you scale as well, because your infrastructure should be able to auto route approvals. What needs to get done? How can we auto route this to this specific person that is directly responsible for this, such so that you're moving forward and not amplifying, the dysfunction that is happening through technology. And understanding that this tech is ultimately as aid to surface blockers. What are the specific things that are happening that will ultimately, stall the project from moving forward on a day-to-day? And also understanding that we need to make sure that we're timestamping decisions. Are the decisions being timestamped? Do we have a specific time as to when these decisions were made, such so that we can then understand, hey, this is the average decision time that it takes for us to make decisions, or for communication to flow from, the person that is actively doing the task to the key decision maker making the final decision. How much time, does that take? And also understanding how we can also shorten that as well. And understanding the different trigger escalations. How can we basically, understand what are the different escalation triggers that ultimately play as we're, doing this specific project or task, and also logging changes, basically understanding, what are the specific changes that ultimately need to be made, and how those are ultimately feeding into the main mission that we have for this specific build, because this ultimately strips out human inconsistency and ultimately lets you see where friction actively lives. And if you're able to then spot where this friction actively lives, then you're then able to scale what it is that you're doing on a day-to-day, because communication ultimately underpins how you then able to build into the future. And this means that you can ultimately build feedback loops that ultimately compress decision cycles, because the more you're able to then compress these decision cycles, the better you're able to then execute on your communication flows by architecting it in such a way that you're then able to make sure that every workflow needs a closing loop. And this closing loop is determined by decisions getting documented. Are you having SOPs? What is the decisions that you're ultimately making, and how are they getting documented? And the actions that are required, what are the specific actions that are required in terms of making sure that these feedback loops ultimately get run through, or what are the specific notifications that the owners are ultimately having? How are these owners being notified? Are they being notified by 5 different versions of reality, or one singular version of reality? And how are they also picking up context as well? And also understanding how the next steps are triggered. How are we actively building these feedback loops such so that the next step is automatically triggered as a result of this? Because if you're not able to close the loops, you ultimately kill momentum, and when momentum dies, the founder becomes the engine once again. Because if the founder, like I said, is acting as the one source of truth for every single thing, ultimately that slows down progress. And being able to build a system that ultimately moves without you and not as a result of you being there. And that means that we ultimately need to make sure that we're enforcing communication discipline, which is also as equally as important, because systems don't fail because they're bad. They fail simply because people ignore them. And what this means is that we need to make sure that we're setting non-negotiables of saying no meetings without an agenda. A lot of time gets wasted in meetings that ultimately have no specific agenda or mission of what needs to get done. And also understanding that no private approvals as to we're not going to hit the specific person with the approval that they need to make, but leaving out all the other stakeholders that need to understand what the decisions made, such so that we build that context layer as well. And understanding that no undocumented decisions go or get approvals, so no undocumented decisions get made or ultimately get passed through without documentation, and no context less handoffs are ultimately done. How we ultimately build context to do this is making sure that we create context before we hand off, and making sure that no work starting without acceptance criteria. We need to make sure that this acceptance criteria is written down such so that we make sure that no work gets started without hitting these specific acceptance criteria, and making sure that no decisions sitting idle past the latency budget. And this ultimately enforces a culture that reinforces mechanisms and not fights against these different mechanisms that we're ultimately building, because the more you're then able to build these mechanisms, the more you're then able to add towards this context architecture that ultimately scales and multiplies your efforts on a day-to-day. And this ultimately matches simply because communication is often taken as a soft skill or one of the things that is not as important, but it's ultimately infrastructure. And this infrastructure ultimately decides how fast decisions move, how aligned your team stays, and how cleanly projects ultimately finish, and how much chaos leaks into execution, because 80% of what actively gets done happens in the preparation phase, or how things are architectured, such so that the 20% of execution becomes so much seamless, because you have one specific goal that you want to hit, and you made sure that your architecture is so solid such so that every single process that precedes it is ultimately as smooth and as seamless as possible. And this ultimately means that founders who scale aren't better managers, they build superior communication architecture such so that their companies become a machine and not necessarily a group chat. Then you're then able to reduce work, increase execution speed, compress decision cycles, remove ambiguity, and also multiply the impact of every team member. And this is the leverage most founders never build, and that is the reason why their growth caps long before their potential does. And if you want to connect with me, you can connect with me through my newsletter, which I have as the first link in the description, X, Instagram, and YouTube as well, just preceding that. And I will see you guys in the next one.